Hey YouTubers, I'm Abhishek for the Wheels and Chips, and today we have with us two amazing cards, the GTX 1060 and the RX 480. These two are the behemoths of the mid-tier range. I mean, they completely blow away the previous premium competition like the GTX 970 out of the water. Beautiful cards for the price. Of course, we got the 1060 for 24,000 bucks and the RX 480 for around 25,500 if I remember correctly. The RX 480 comes with 8 gigs of RAM, a 256 GB per second memory bandwidth, and of course 1.1 GHz stock frequency, which can be boosted up to around 1250 MHz or 1.25 GHz. Whereas the GTX 1060 comes with around 6 GB of GDDR5 RAM, which is kind of weird because you usually go from 4 to 8 and such, and it's a rare occasion that we still have 3 to 6. But then again, it's still better than getting a 4 GB variant, so I'd say it's good enough. Anyways, it has a 192 GB per second memory bandwidth along with 1.4 GHz stock frequency. So that's good, I'd say, which can be boosted up to 1650 MHz or 1.65 GHz. So these both are reference card, or as Nvidia likes to call it, the Founders Edition. And we'll be going through some real-world games instead of just synthetic benchmarks like the Indian Valley that you're seeing behind me. You know, that's just for a pleasing appeal of the entire video. I'll probably cut this out of the video. I don't know, if it comes out good, I'll keep it. So what are we going to do? We're going to run a list of benchmarks. Gotcha. No, we're not going to do that. We're going to play some cool games, get their stats like the Assassin's Creed, the Crysis 3 and stuff like that. I know Crysis is old, but you know, if it can run Crysis, probably it can run any other game as well. Not really, we have a lot of amazing new games, so yeah. I know, to be honest, that's not the same right now because Crysis 3 is kind of outdated, and there are a lot of games like Witcher 3 that utilize a lot of advanced setting like ambient occlusion, real-time kind of shadows, and the hair works, the hair effects and stuff like that, and you can apply that to other characters as well. So there are a lot of games that had kind of made the Crysis 3 look like, you know, a very, very old video game. Though it does look good, to be honest. Anyways, we will be comparing the GTX 1060 and the RX 480 in these kind of games with DirectX 11 and DirectX 12, DirectX 12. God, why do I do that? And also in different resolutions like 1080p and 1440p. That's 2560 to 1440. Wow, that's a lot of numbers. I'm getting confused between the 1060 and the 480, and sometimes I'm just going on saying like 1080, 1070 and doing the shots again and again. It's so frustrating. Anyways, what are we waiting for after the review? Speaking about gaming, we're rocking a Skylake i5 6600. Unfortunately, it's not the Unlock K edition, and in my opinion, we've reached a point in CPU performance where we don't even need an Unlock multiplier to obtain a good gaming performance, to be honest. On the hard disk front, we have a regular 2TB Seagate drive, which offers optimum performance that should be adequate for gaming. To put things in perspective, this comparison is to help the average buyer decide between the GTX 1060 and the RX 480. And I feel the setup I'm using right now does the job very well. Let's begin our comparison charts with the DirectX 11 benchmarks. Here is Overwatch. The GTX 1060 absolutely destroys the RX 480 in both 1080p and 1440p, a difference of over 24 frames in 1080p and around 15 frames in 1440p when the preset is set to Ultra. Moving on to Metro Last Light, we see a similar story, but the difference isn't as substantial. With the setting at very high and no SSAA and no physics, we get a difference of 10 FPS in 1080p and 8 FPS in 1440p. While in the GTA 5, the RX 480 takes an even worse hit, with its 1080p performance barely edging out the 1440p on the GTX 1060. To be honest, it's a little disappointing since I was rooting for AMD to come out on top on this one. Anyways, taking a look at the division, we see a similar story with the RX 480 lagging behind and struggling hard to cope up with the GTX 1060, while the RX 480 finally flexes some of its theoretical muscles in Crysis 3 by closing the gap to just 3 FPS in both 1080p and 1440p. Now let's have a look at the DirectX 12 performance to see if it actually fails the RX 480. The Ashes of Singularity is one of the first games to be built with DirectX 12 from scratch, and the performance is indicative of it, at least in 1080p where the RX 480 scores 36 FPS, which is 2 more than the GTX 1060. While on the 1440p, both of them are almost tied with no definitive winner. Proceeding to Gears of War Ultimate Edition, we see the RX 480 pull ahead by a margin of 2 FPS in 1080p, while it pulls ahead with a margin of 4 FPS in 1440p. Now that's what we're talking about. And the Hitman 2016 also speaks of a similar story, where the RX 480 makes good use of the DirectX 12 by gaining a sizable lead of around 8 FPS in both 1080p and 1440p. Finally, that is the kind of consistency that I'm expecting from something that clocks in at around 5.8 teraflops. Beautiful. And we approach our end with the rise of the Tomb Raider. We see Nvidia GTX 1060 bouncing back with the 14 FPS lead in 1080p and 6 FPS lead in 1440p. Although to be fair, the Radeon does beat the GTX 1060 in most DirectX 12 games, so we can't really say that the GTX 1060 walks away over here, but when it comes to DirectX 11, Nvidia does have an uncompromisable lead. So in spite of the higher shader count on the RX 480 as well as the higher texture mapping units and the increased memory bandwidth along with the 8GB GDDR5 which offers 2 more than the 2GB DDR5 on the GDDR5 on the 1060, the RX 480 should perform extremely well, right? But the 1060 does have a couple of tricks up its sleeve as well. The GTX 1060 also has a higher clock rate at around 1.4 GHz as compared to the 1.1 GHz stock clock rate on the RX 480. It also has a higher pixel rate at around 67 gigapixel per second as compared to the 40 gigapixel per second on the RX 480. When it comes to turbo boost, the GTX 1060 turbos like a monster, an additional 250 MHz compared to the additional 150 MHz on the RX 480. Well, that's not all. The render processors are also slightly more on the GTX 1060 at around 48 versus 32, which could also mean that the GTX 1060 has around 50% more render processors to work with as compared to the one on the RX 480. That does add value to the GTX 1060. And the overall TDP is also lower at the GTX 1060 at around 80, well, compared to the 150 watts on the RX 480, which is a huge factor for gamers because you might have a rig that has a lower card power supply if you got it earlier, like you got a 750 Ti. And at that time, it does matter a lot because you're not going to go and change your power supply. You're not going to invest on that because you've already invested on a card like the GTX 1060 or the 480. Or if you're planning on investing on a card. So I'd say that the GTX 1060 is a great value for money if you're going to factor that into consideration. So I'm as stumped as you are. I thought the RX 480 is going to have a landslide victory because of its floating point performance, which is around 5.8 teraflops, whereas compared to the measly 3.6 teraflops of the Nvidia GTX 1060. But it appears that the floating point performance is not know-it-all, say-it-all. Well, who knew that? Who saw that coming, because the floating point performance has been a better representation of the compute performance so far, but Nvidia's optimizations seem to surpass that because a GTX 1070 that just has 3.6 teraflops can beat an RX 480 with 5.8 teraflops. That is just damn freaking huge, and there is a lot of numbers as I just said earlier. Wow, which is so confusing even with a script. Anyways, if you're gonna buy a card and if you're gonna play a lot of legacy games as well as the old games like 2014 to 15 to the early 2016-ish games with a lot of DX11 components, of course you wouldn't be knowing if it's DX11 components or not, but they would be advertised as DX11, and most of them are advertised as DX12 compatible, although they don't have the DX12 built in from the scratch, but they do offer some kind of additional performance boost when compared to playing them on DX11. I'd say that go for the GTX 1060 because a lot of games are going to perform staggeringly well on the GTX 1060 on DirectX 11 when compared to the RX 480, even though it has the additional performance kind of, a lot of performance benefits and stuff like that, because the GTX 1060 has around 14% increase. If you're going to see the charts and the overall frame rate representation that I just showed earlier, you could see that there's around 14% additional performance boost on the DirectX 11 for GTX 1060, whereas on DirectX 12 you're not losing anything. There's hardly a 0.2 or 0.4% difference where the RX 480 takes the lead, and that's also representation of the actual, completely optimized titles for the RX 480 or the DirectX 12. So even taking that into account, you're not going to lose anything. But if you're going to future-proof yourself, like if you're going to say that I'm going to get an SLI and get a lot of DirectX 12 games in the future, so get an RX 480 by all means. And if you're someone who just wants to show off like, I have 8GB GDDR5, just get the RX 480 because you're not losing on anything. Of course, when it comes to the frame rate, on the 1080p side, you get around 10% boost on the GTX 1060 and close to 7% boost on the 1440p gaming on GTX 1060 as well. Nope, no RX 480 cookie over here. Unfortunately, I'm stumped as you are, as I just stated, man. This is a landslide victory in my opinion, even though it does not seem like a landslide victory. It is, because the 1060 in compared to the RX 480 on a lot of spec sheet, a lot of texture mapping units and fill rates and stuff like that, it just it just weighs down when compared to the RX 480. So in that regard, I'd say that Nvidia has done an awesome work by collaborating with the developers and going just deep down within and saying that this is going to work well with the Nvidia, and we don't want it to work well with AMD. Although it's kind of destructive to the end user because you're not getting real value for your money, like because Nvidia is saying, hey, we're going to be douchebags and they're going to just block the AMD from just coming in. And even though we have underperforming card, we're going to make it look like it's awesome. That is bad. But then again, it does look like the Pascal architecture is better, and Nvidia is doing a lot of work to maintain that the Nvidia titled games have a lot of frame rates and perform very well and punch very well above their weight. So this has been my review of the GTX 1060 versus the RX 480, and I just realized that I'm getting confused because Nvidia has its own GTX 480. Finally, I understood why I'm going for like GTX 480, GTX 480, and GTX 480 all the time. But that was seriously a great card. And while it did overheat like a monster, it was a great card. Anyways, that is pretty much it for this video. If you like this video, please do give us a like. If you hated this video, it's okay. You can dislike it. I'll get to know that these kind of videos are boring for you. And if you love this video, by chance you felt like, oh wow, this is a great video. These guys are finally doing some nice stuff. Why don't you get subscribed so that we can do more of that stuff? Please subscribe and inspire us. Thank you so much for watching. I love you guys. Take care and have a fantastic day. Bye.